My sister isn't my sister. She's my mom. My parents covered it up for 19 years. The hospital intake form asked for my mother's medical history, and I texted Jenna to ask if there was any history of anemia in the family. She texted back 3 question marks, then called me immediately. Her voice sounded strange when she asked why I needed to know. I explained I was in the emergency room with severe fatigue and dizziness, that they were running tests and needed family medical history. Jenna went quiet for so long I thought the call dropped. Then she said something that made no sense. She said she needed to tell me something she should have told me years ago, that she was sorry, that our parents made her promise never to say anything. I asked what she was talking about. She said she was my mother, not my sister, my actual biological mother. The phone slipped from my hand and clattered on the floor. A nurse picked it up and asked if I was okay. I couldn't answer, couldn't breathe. The nurse took my phone and spoke to Jenna, getting the medical information she needed. Then she handed the phone back and left the room. Jenna was crying on the other end, apologizing over and over. I hung up on her, sat there in the hospital bed with an IV in my arm, staring at the white walls, trying to make sense of what she'd just said. Jenna was 34 years old. I was 19. The math worked, but nothing else did. Jenna was my sister. She lived 3 states away, visited twice a year, sent birthday cards and Christmas presents. She worked as a graphic designer, had an apartment in Portland, dated guys our parents disapproved of. She wasn't my mother. My mother was Helen, age 53, who drove me to this hospital an hour ago and was currently in the cafeteria getting coffee. My father was Robert, age 55, who was at work and didn't know I was here yet. They raised me, fed me, helped with homework, attended every school event. They were my parents. The nurse came back with a doctor who explained my test results showed severe iron deficiency anemia, likely due to heavy periods I'd been ignoring for months. They wanted to keep me overnight for observation and an iron infusion. I nodded but didn't really hear him. My mind was spinning with Jenna's words, replaying them over and over. Helen came back carrying 2 coffees just as the doctor was leaving. She asked what he said and I told her about the anemia and needing to stay overnight. She sat down in the chair beside the bed, sipped her coffee, said she'd call Robert and have him bring me clothes and toiletries. Then she pulled out her phone and started texting. I watched her type, watched her calm expression, watched her act completely normal. Finally, I asked her directly. Asked if Jenna was my mother. Helen's hand froze mid-text. The phone slipped slightly in her grip. She recovered quickly and asked what I was talking about. Why would I ask something absurd? I told her Jenna had just told me on the phone when the nurse asked for family medical history. Helen's face went through several expressions, shock and anger and something that might have been fear. She stood up so fast her coffee spilled, brown liquid spreading across the linoleum floor. She said Jenna had no right to say anything, that this wasn't the time or place for this conversation, that I needed to focus on getting better. I asked her again, demanded a real answer. Helen looked at the door, at the spilled coffee, anywhere but at me. Then she sat back down heavily and covered her face with her hands. When she finally looked up, her eyes were wet. She said yes. Jenna was my biological mother. She'd gotten pregnant at 15 and couldn't raise a baby, so Helen and Robert had adopted me. They'd done it to protect everyone involved, to give me a stable home, to let Jenna finish growing up. She said it with this tone that suggested I should be grateful, that I should understand they'd done the right thing. I felt my hands start shaking, gripping the thin hospital blanket. 15 years old. Jenna had been 15 when she had me, which meant she'd been 14 when she got pregnant. I asked who my father was. Helen's face went carefully blank. She said that wasn't important, that it didn't matter, that the only thing that mattered was I'd been raised in a loving home. I told her it absolutely mattered. She refused to answer, just kept saying it was complicated and in the past. A nurse came in to clean up the spilled coffee. Helen stood and said she needed to make some phone calls, that she'd be back soon. I grabbed her arm and told her not to leave, that we needed to finish this conversation. She pulled away gently and said we'd talk later when I was feeling better, that the hospital wasn't the place for family discussions. Then she left, actually left me alone in that room with my entire world falling apart. I picked up my phone and called Jenna back. She answered immediately, her voice thick from crying. I asked her to tell me everything, starting from the beginning. She took a shaky breath and said she'd been 14 when it happened, a freshman in high school. She'd gotten pregnant by someone she couldn't talk about, someone our parents refused to let her name. When they found out about the pregnancy, they pulled her out of school, told everyone she was going to live with an aunt for her health. Instead, they kept her locked in the house for months while they figured out what to do. Jenna's voice cracked as she described those months, how Helen and Robert had been furious and ashamed, how they'd treated her pregnancy as a sin that needed to be hidden, how they'd contacted lawyers about adoption but ultimately decided to keep it in the family. Helen would pretend to be pregnant using padding and loose clothes. They'd claim the baby as theirs. Jenna would return to school after the birth and resume her life as their daughter, not as someone's mother. Jenna had protested at first, said she wanted to keep her baby, but they'd threatened her. Said if she didn't cooperate, they'd send her away to a home for troubled girls. Said she was too young and immature to raise a child. Said this was the only way to protect everyone's reputation. So she'd agreed because she was 14 and terrified and had no other options. She'd given birth to me in their home with only a midwife present, No hospital records, no official documentation. Then Helen and Robert had taken me while Jenna was still bleeding and in pain, had handed her back her school books and told her to move on. I couldn't speak. The hospital room felt too small, the walls pressing in. Jenna kept talking, words pouring out after 19 years of forced silence. She said watching me grow up calling Helen mom had destroyed her. Every birthday, every Mother's Day, every milestone had been torture. She'd wanted to tell me so many times, but Helen and Robert had made it clear that telling the truth would mean losing all contact with me. They'd threatened to move away, to cut her off completely, to make sure she never saw me again. So she'd played the role of the cool older sister, visiting when allowed, maintaining the lie because it was the only way to stay in my life. She'd gone to therapy for years, struggling with depression and guilt. She'd tried to have other relationships but couldn't commit to anyone because she was carrying this massive secret. Her voice broke completely when she said she was sorry, that she should have fought harder, should have told me sooner, but she'd been so scared of losing me. I told her I needed time to process this and hung up, lay back against the pillows and stared at the ceiling tiles, counting them over and over to avoid thinking. A different nurse came in to start the iron infusion. She chatted about the weather and asked if my mom was coming back soon. I didn't correct her. Didn't know what to say. My mom wasn't my mom. My sister was my mom. My parents were my grandparents. Everything I thought I knew about my identity was wrong. The nurse left and I was alone again with thoughts I couldn't organize. Helen came back an hour later with Robert. He looked uncomfortable and angry, his jaw tight. He sat down without making eye contact and said they needed to explain some things. I told him Jenna had already explained. He said Jenna didn't know the whole story, that she'd been a child when this happened and didn't understand the difficult decisions they'd had to make. I asked what decisions exactly, what could possibly justify lying to me for 19 years. Robert leaned forward, elbows on his knees, hands clasped. He said they'd done what was best for everyone involved, that Jenna had been raped by someone in a position of authority, someone whose prosecution would have destroyed multiple families and caused a massive scandal in their community. They'd been members of a prominent church where Robert served as a deacon. The man who raped Jenna had been their youth pastor, a married man with children of his own, respected and trusted by everyone. When Jenna finally told them what happened, she was already 12 weeks pregnant. Robert and Helen had gone to the church leadership first, looking for guidance and support. Instead, the church had pressured them to stay quiet, to handle it privately, to protect the reputation of the ministry. The youth pastor had been quietly dismissed and moved to another church in another state. No police report had been filed, no consequences had been pursued. Instead, Robert and Helen had been told to deal with their daughter's pregnancy discreetly and to consider it a test of their faith and discretion. The room started spinning. I gripped the bed rails and asked if he understood what he was telling me. That Jenna had been raped at 14 by a trusted authority figure, that she'd been forced to carry the pregnancy in isolation, that she'd been coerced into giving up her baby, and that the rapist had faced no legal consequences. Robert's face reddened and he said it wasn't that simple, that times were different back then, that they'd done what they thought was right. I asked if they'd even considered that they were protecting a child predator, that their decision to stay silent had probably allowed him to abuse other girls. Robert stood up abruptly and said I was being disrespectful and judgmental, that I didn't understand the pressure they'd been under, the position they'd been in. Helen tried to calm him down, but he was already heading for the door. He said he'd be in the waiting room and that Helen should handle this since she was better at dealing with emotional situations. Then he left. Helen moved to the chair beside my bed and reached for my hand. I pulled away. She looked hurt but continued speaking in that gentle voice she used when she was trying to convince me of something. She said they'd made the best decision they could with the information they had at the time, that Jenna had been too young to be a mother, that raising me themselves had given me stability and opportunities I wouldn't have had otherwise, that keeping the rape quiet had protected Jenna from trauma and gossip, that sometimes protecting your family meant making hard choices that others might not understand. I asked if Jenna had agreed with any of this, or if they'd simply made all the decisions for her. Helen hesitated before admitting that Jenna had been difficult about it at first, but had eventually come to understand it was for the best. I asked if by difficult she meant Jenna had tried to keep her baby and they'd forced her to give me up. Helen's silence was answer enough. I asked Helen directly if she'd ever considered that what they did was wrong, that taking a rape victim's baby and forcing her to pretend it never happened was abusive. Helen's expression hardened. She said she'd provided me with a good home, that I'd never wanted for anything, that I'd been loved and cared for my entire life. She said Jenna had gone on to finish high school and college, had built a career, had lived her life without the burden of single motherhood as a teenager. She acted as if she'd done everyone a favor, as if the arrangement had been beneficial rather than traumatic. I told her that didn't make it right, that Jenna had spent 19 years unable to acknowledge her own child, that I'd spent 19 years not knowing my real mother, that the rapist had never been held accountable. Helen stood up, her face flushed with anger. She said I was being ungrateful and dramatic, that I needed to calm down and think about everything they'd sacrificed to raise me. Then she walked out. I was discharged the next morning with iron supplements and instructions to follow up with my regular doctor. Helen came to pick me up, but we didn't speak during the drive home. Robert was at work, probably avoiding me. When we got to the house I'd grown up in thinking it was my parents' house and not my grandparents' house, Helen said she needed to run errands and left immediately. I went to my room and called Jenna, asked her to come visit, that we needed to talk in person. She said she'd take emergency leave from work and drive down, that she could be there in 2 days. I spent those 2 days avoiding Helen and Robert as much as possible. They tried to act normal, making meals and asking about my health, but I couldn't participate in the pretense anymore. Every interaction felt contaminated by the lies they'd built our family on. I researched adoption law and discovered that in our state, if an adoption wasn't properly finalized with legal documentation, the biological parent could potentially challenge it. I wondered if Jenna had ever signed away her parental rights, or if that was another thing Helen and Robert had simply claimed without actual legal backing. Jenna arrived on a Friday evening. I met her at the door before Helen or Robert could intercept. She looked exhausted, like she hadn't slept since our phone call. We went to my room and closed the door. For a long moment, we just looked at each other. This woman I'd known as my sister my entire life was actually my mother. She'd been at my birthday parties, my school plays, my graduation. She'd given me advice about boys and college and life, all while carrying the secret that she'd given birth to me, that I was her daughter, not her sister. She started crying first, and then I was crying too. We hugged, and it felt different than before, heavier somehow, more real. When we pulled apart, she sat on my bed and I sat beside her. She asked how I was handling everything. I told her honestly that I was angry and confused and felt betrayed by everyone. She nodded and said she understood, that she'd felt that way for 19 years. I asked her to tell me about the rape, about the youth pastor. She flinched at the word rape but didn't deny it. She said his name was David Thornton. He'd been the youth pastor at their church for 3 years, popular with all the teenagers, organizing mission trips and youth group activities. He'd started paying special attention to Jenna during her 8th grade year, telling her she was mature for her age, that she had spiritual gifts others didn't recognize. He'd arranged to give her private Bible study sessions at the church, separate from the other kids. Helen and Robert had been thrilled that their daughter was so committed to her faith. They'd never questioned why she was spending so much time alone with David. The first assault happened in his church office after one of those private sessions. He'd locked the door and told her this was God's plan, that their special relationship was blessed. She'd been 13 years old and didn't know how to refuse an adult in authority, especially one who spoke with religious conviction. The assaults continued for months. By the time she realized she was pregnant, she was too terrified and confused to tell anyone. Jenna's hands shook as she described finally telling Helen about the pregnancy. She'd expected her mother to protect her, to call the police, to make it stop. Instead, Helen had called Robert home from work and they'd had a closed-door meeting that lasted hours. When they finally talked to Jenna, their first questions weren't about her safety or well-being. They asked if she'd done anything to encourage David's attention, if she'd dressed immodestly, if she'd been alone with him inappropriately. They'd treated it as her fault, as her sin, as something she'd brought on herself. When Jenna had broken down and insisted she'd done nothing wrong, that David had assaulted her, Robert had told her to stop speaking that way about a man of God. They'd contacted the church leadership that same night. Jenna had been forced to sit in a meeting with the senior pastor, several elders, and David Thornton himself. David had apologized for his weakness, had claimed Jenna had tempted him, had promised to work on his marriage and his relationship with God. The church leaders had prayed over him and decided to move him to a fresh start in another state. No one had prayed over Jenna or offered her support. I felt sick listening to this, asked if there was any documentation, any evidence of what happened. Jenna shook her head and said the church had handled everything internally. There were probably meeting minutes somewhere in their records, but nothing that would explicitly detail the rape or the pregnancy. Helen and Robert had pulled her out of school shortly after, claiming she needed to stay with family for health reasons. She'd spent her entire pregnancy isolated in the house, not allowed to see friends or attend any activities. Helen had worn pregnancy padding when going out in public, building the false narrative that she was expecting. When Jenna went into labor, Helen had called a midwife who was part of their church community, someone who could be trusted to stay quiet. Jenna had given birth in what was now my bedroom, actually in this same room where we were sitting. The midwife had handed the baby to Helen immediately after cutting the cord. Jenna had barely gotten to hold me before I was taken away. She'd asked to see me over the next few days, but Helen had said it was better if she didn't bond, that it would make the transition easier. Within a week, Jenna had been sent back to school with instructions to act normal and never speak about what happened. I asked if she'd signed adoption papers. She said no. There had never been any legal adoption process. Helen and Robert had simply registered my birth as their own child, using the midwife as a witness. The birth certificate listed Helen as my mother and Robert as my father. Jenna's name appeared nowhere on any official documents. I was legally their child, not hers. She'd never had any parental rights to give up because she'd never been recognized as my parent in the first place. The entire arrangement had been built on lies and falsified documents. I asked if that was even legal. Jenna said probably not, that it was likely some form of fraud, but who would they report it to? The people who'd committed the fraud were the same people who'd raised me, who had legal custody, who could make my life difficult if she caused trouble. So she'd stayed silent and played along, visiting when allowed, maintaining the fiction of being my older sister, because it was the only way to remain in my life at all. Helen knocked on my door around 9 that evening, said dinner was ready if we were hungry. Neither of us responded. She knocked again and said we needed to come downstairs and talk as a family. Jenna told her to go away. Helen's voice got sharper, more insistent. She said she wouldn't be spoken to that way in her own home, that we both needed to show some respect. Jenna stood up and opened the door. The two women stared at each other, and I saw something pass between them, years of resentment and pain and anger. Jenna said she was done respecting people who'd stolen her baby and forced her into silence. Helen said she'd given Jenna a chance at a normal life by taking responsibility for a situation Jenna had created. Jenna's voice went cold and dangerous. She said she hadn't created anything, that she'd been raped by an adult man while she was a child, that Helen had chosen to protect the rapist and the church's reputation instead of her own daughter. Helen slapped her. The sound cracked through the hallway. Jenna's head snapped to the side and a red mark bloomed on her cheek. I moved between them before Helen could hit her again. Told Helen to get out, to leave us alone. Helen looked at me with this expression of betrayal, as if I'd turned on her instead of the other way around. She said I didn't understand what they'd been through, the sacrifices they'd made, the burden they'd carried. I told her the only burden I saw was the one they'd forced on Jenna, taking her baby and then making her pretend to be grateful for it. Helen's face crumpled and she started crying, these dramatic sobs that sounded performative. She said she'd loved me as her own daughter, that she'd done everything she could to give me a good life, that this was how I repaid her kindness. Jenna told her to stop manipulating the situation, that nothing she'd done erased the fundamental wrong of stealing someone's child. Helen wiped her eyes and said she wouldn't stand here and be insulted in her own home. She turned and went downstairs. We heard her talking to Robert in low, urgent tones. Then the front door slammed. Through my window, I watched them get in their car and drive away. Jenna and I sat back down on my bed. The house felt different without them in it, quieter but also heavier with the weight of everything unsaid for so many years. I asked Jenna what she wanted to do now, if she wanted to pursue any legal action or just leave things as they were. She said she'd thought about it constantly over the years, imagined different scenarios where she told the truth and fought for recognition as my mother. But she'd always stopped herself because she didn't want to disrupt my life, didn't want to be the person who destroyed the only family I'd ever known. Now that I knew the truth anyway, she wasn't sure what came next. I told her I wanted to know more about David Thornton, the man who'd raped her and was biologically my father. Wanted to know if he was still working in churches, still having access to teenage girls. Jenna pulled out her phone and did a search, found him immediately. David Thornton was currently serving as the senior pastor of a large church in Arizona. His bio on the church website talked about his decades of ministry experience, his commitment to youth outreach, his dedication to mentoring the next generation of believers. There was a photo of him with his wife and grown children, looking respectable and successful. The church had over 1,000 members. I felt rage building in my chest. This man had raped a 14-year-old girl, gotten her pregnant, faced no consequences, and had gone on to build a successful career in ministry. He was probably still in positions of authority over young people, probably still using religious language to manipulate and control. I asked Jenna if she'd ever considered reporting him to the police. She said she had, many times, but there was no evidence. It had happened 19 years ago. There were no medical records from the assaults, no rape kit, no documentation except maybe some church meeting minutes that would be protected as internal documents. It would be her word against his, and he was now a respected pastor with a congregation that would defend him. The church that had covered it up originally would deny everything. Helen and Robert would likely refuse to testify truthfully. She'd consulted with lawyers before and they'd all said the same thing, that without evidence or witnesses willing to testify, a prosecution would be nearly impossible. The statute of limitations had passed in most categories. Her only option might be a civil suit, but that would require money she didn't have and would result in years of her life consumed by legal battles. I asked if there were other victims. Jenna said she didn't know for certain, but statistically, men who abuse children rarely do it only once. David had probably abused other girls at the church before her and likely continued after he moved. The church's pattern of covering it up and moving him to a new location was exactly what allowed predators to continue. She'd thought about trying to find other victims, about reaching out to people who'd been in youth group around that time, but she'd been too afraid. Afraid of being labeled a troublemaker, afraid of not being believed, afraid of Helen and Robert cutting off all contact with me as punishment. So she'd stayed silent while David continued his ministry career uninterrupted. I told her that had to change, that we needed to do something. She looked at me with this mixture of hope and fear, asked what I had in mind. I said we needed to find other victims if they existed, needed to document the church's cover-up, needed to make enough noise that people couldn't ignore it anymore. Even if criminal prosecution wasn't possible, we could at least expose him publicly and protect future potential victims. We spent the next 3 days researching, found the name of the church where Helen and Robert had been members when Jenna was raped, Crossroads Community Church. It still existed, though under different leadership now. The senior pastor from 19 years ago had retired. We made a list of people who would have been in youth group during that time period, found some of them on social media. Jenna reached out to a few she'd been close with, carefully asking if they remembered David Thornton and if he'd ever made them uncomfortable. Most didn't respond. 2 did. One said she remembered David being kind of intense but nothing inappropriate. The other, a woman named Claire, asked if something had happened to Jenna. Jenna called her and they talked for over an hour. Claire admitted that David had made her uncomfortable too, that he'd given her unwanted attention and physical contact that felt wrong, but nothing as severe as what happened to Jenna. She'd never reported it because she'd thought maybe she was misinterpreting his intentions. When Jenna told her about the rape and pregnancy, Claire went silent for a long time. Then she said she'd suspected something was wrong when Jenna had suddenly disappeared from school for months, but the explanation about staying with family for health reasons had seemed plausible. She asked if Jenna had ever reported it. Jenna explained the whole situation, how the church had covered it up, how Helen and Robert had taken her baby and raised it as their own. Claire was horrified and said she wanted to help however she could. Helen and Robert returned home on the 3rd day. They walked in to find Jenna and me sitting at the kitchen table surrounded by printed documents and notes. Helen looked at our faces and seemed to understand something had shifted. She asked what we were doing. I told her we were gathering information about David Thornton and the church's cover-up of his abuse. Robert's face went red immediately. He said we were opening up old wounds for no reason, that dragging up the past would only cause more pain. I asked him if he cared at all that David was currently a senior pastor with access to hundreds of young people, that his silence had enabled a predator to continue abusing his position. Robert said I was being naive, that I didn't understand how complicated these situations were, that sometimes the right thing to do was protect people from scandal and gossip. Jenna stood up and told him directly that protecting a child rapist was never the right thing to do, that his choice to prioritize the church's reputation over her safety had been cowardice, not wisdom. Robert stepped toward her with his hand raised and I moved between them. Told him if he touched her, I'd call the police immediately. He lowered his hand, but his expression remained furious. Helen tried a different approach. She sat down at the table and said she understood we were upset, but we needed to think about the consequences of what we were doing. If we made accusations against David and the church, it would become public knowledge that Jenna had been raped and that I'd been born from that rape. People would talk. Our family would be the subject of gossip and speculation. My future could be affected by being known as the child of a rape. Jenna's career could suffer from the attention. Was it worth all that pain just to pursue something that happened nearly 2 decades ago? I looked at her and realized she still didn't understand. She thought the problem was the potential embarrassment, not the fact that a predator was still in ministry. I told her I didn't care about gossip, that the only thing that mattered was preventing David from hurting anyone else. Helen shook her head and said I was too young to understand how the real world worked, that idealism didn't pay bills or protect reputations. I told her I'd rather have idealism than her moral cowardice. She flinched at that but didn't argue. Over the next week, we kept digging. Found another woman, Ashley, who'd been in youth group and admitted David had assaulted her too, though she'd never reported it. She was willing to make a statement. Found another Rebecca, who said David had groomed her with inappropriate messages but nothing physical had happened because her parents had pulled her from youth group for unrelated reasons. Claire connected us with 2 more women who'd had concerning interactions with David. We had 6 women total willing to testify to a pattern of inappropriate behavior, grooming, and in 2 cases, sexual assault. I contacted a lawyer who specialized in clergy abuse cases. Her name was Monica Hayes. She reviewed our documentation and said we had enough for a civil case against David and potentially against the church for their negligent cover-up. She explained the process would be long and difficult, that we'd face intense scrutiny and victim blaming, but she believed we had a solid case. She'd represent us pro bono because she was building a portfolio against institutional abuse, and this case fit her mission. Jenna decided to move forward. The other women agreed to join the lawsuit. Monica filed the civil suit 3 weeks later. The complaint named David Thornton as the primary defendant and Crossroads Community Church as a co-defendant for their failure to protect minors in their care and their active cover-up of abuse. The local news picked up the story immediately. The headline read, "Local Church Faces Abuse Cover-Up Allegations." David's current church in Arizona issued a statement saying they were conducting an internal investigation. David himself released a statement through his lawyer denying all allegations and characterizing the lawsuit as an attack by troubled individuals seeking attention and money. Helen and Robert were furious. They showed up at my door with a printed copy of the news article. Robert demanded to know if I understood what I'd done, how I'd dragged the family name through the mud, how I'd associated us with this scandal. I told him they'd created the scandal 19 years ago, when they chose to protect a rapist. He said I was destroying everything they'd built, every relationship they had in their community. I said good, that maybe their community needed to know what kind of people they'd been defending. The harassment started within days. Members of Crossroads Community Church who still remembered Helen and Robert and couldn't believe these accusations were true. They called our house, sent letters, posted comments on the news articles about the case. They attacked Jenna's character, called her a liar seeking attention, suggested she'd been promiscuous as a teenager and was now trying to blame an innocent man. They attacked me for supporting her, for betraying the parents who'd raised me. Some of the messages were vicious, full of religious condemnation and threats. Monica warned us this was normal in clergy abuse cases, that institutions and their defenders always attacked victims to protect their own reputations. She filed for a restraining order against the most aggressive harassers and contacted the police about the threatening messages. The police took statements but said unless the threats became more specific, there wasn't much they could do. We changed our phone numbers and increased security at our homes. Jenna moved in with me at Helen and Robert's house since they'd essentially abandoned it anyway, moving temporarily to a friend's place to avoid being associated with us. The church's defense strategy became clear through their legal filings. They claimed Jenna had been a troubled teenager with behavioral problems, that David had been trying to help her spiritually, that any physical contact had been misinterpreted by an unstable young girl. They produced character witnesses who testified that David had been a devoted youth pastor who'd helped dozens of teenagers through difficult times. They claimed the church had handled the situation appropriately by moving David when concerns arose, that this showed their commitment to protecting their congregation. They argued that the statute of limitations had expired on most claims and that bringing up incidents from nearly 2 decades ago was an abuse of the legal system. Monica systematically dismantled each argument. She brought in expert witnesses on grooming behavior, on institutional cover-ups, on the long-term effects of childhood sexual abuse. She presented the pattern of David's behavior across multiple victims as evidence of predatory intent. She showed how the church's response had prioritized protecting David over protecting children. She introduced evidence that David had been the subject of similar complaints at his subsequent churches, complaints that had also been quietly dismissed. The trial lasted 3 weeks. Every day brought new revelations and painful testimony. Jenna had to describe the assaults in explicit detail, while David sat across the courtroom looking sympathetic and wronged. The other victims testified to their experiences. Claire described David's inappropriate touching and comments. Ashley detailed how he'd assaulted her in a church storage room. The others talked about grooming behavior, about how David had isolated them and manipulated them using religious authority. The defense attorneys tried to discredit each woman, bringing up their relationship histories, their mental health struggles, anything that could suggest they were unreliable. Monica countered by showing how all their struggles were consistent with trauma responses from childhood abuse. She brought in Helen and Robert as hostile witnesses. They were forced to testify under oath about what had happened 19 years ago. Robert tried to minimize it, claiming they'd simply helped their daughter through a difficult situation. Monica produced the church meeting minutes she'd subpoenaed, documents that showed the church leadership had explicitly discussed the need to move David to avoid scandal. Helen had to admit on the stand that she'd taken Jenna's baby and raised it as her own without legal adoption. The judge's expression when hearing that testimony made it clear he found their actions deeply problematic. The jury deliberated for 2 days. When they returned, they found in favor of Jenna and the other plaintiffs. The verdict included monetary damages against both David and the church, totaling over $3 million split among the 6 women. More importantly, the verdict included a requirement that the church implement comprehensive child protection policies, mandatory reporting training for all staff, and independent oversight of youth programs. David's church in Arizona terminated his employment before the verdict was even read. Several other churches where he'd worked over the years announced investigations into his conduct. Former members came forward with new allegations, creating a cascade of accountability that had been prevented for decades. Helen and Robert's involvement in the cover-up became public knowledge. The news articles detailed how they'd stolen their daughter's baby and falsified birth records. Robert was forced to resign from his position at their current church. Helen lost her social standing in their community. Several of their friends cut off contact, horrified by what had been revealed. Some defended them, claiming they'd made the best decision they could under difficult circumstances. But most people saw their actions for what they were, a betrayal of their daughter and an enabling of a predator. I had to testify during the trial about growing up not knowing my real mother, about the impact of discovering at 19 that my entire identity had been built on lies. The defense tried to argue that I'd had a good childhood and therefore no harm had been done. Monica asked me directly if I felt harmed by what Helen and Robert had done. I said yes, absolutely yes. Not knowing my real mother, not knowing my medical history, not understanding my own origins, these were fundamental harms that had affected my sense of self. Learning that my biological father was a child rapist who'd never been held accountable, that was harm. Understanding that the people I'd trusted most had prioritized reputation over truth and justice, that was harm. The impact wasn't just about material circumstances, it was about trust and truth and identity. The jury seemed to understand. After the verdict, several jurors approached Jenna to tell her they believed her and were sorry for what she'd endured. One older woman hugged her and said she wished she could have protected her 19 years ago. The aftermath of the trial stretched over months. David filed for bankruptcy to avoid paying the judgment. The church's insurance covered most of their portion, though their premiums increased dramatically. Monica helped us navigate the complex process of actually collecting the damages. More importantly, the publicity from the case led to policy changes. The denomination that Crossroads Community Church belonged to implemented new mandatory reporting requirements and accountability structures for handling abuse allegations. Several advocacy organizations used our case as an example in their training materials about institutional failure and cover-ups. Jenna used her portion of the settlement to establish a scholarship fund for survivors of clergy abuse who wanted to pursue therapy or education. She quit her job in Portland and moved back to be closer to me. We were slowly building a relationship as mother and daughter instead of sisters. It was awkward sometimes, figuring out how to relate to each other in this new way, but we were both committed to making it work. Helen and Robert tried to reconcile with us several months after the trial. They showed up at the apartment Jenna and I now shared. Helen had lost weight and looked older, worn down by the social consequences of the trial. Robert seemed diminished somehow, his usual confidence replaced by uncertainty. They said they'd been in counseling and had come to understand that their actions had been wrong. They wanted to apologize and try to rebuild our relationship. Jenna listened to their apology and then asked if they'd reported David to the police when they first found out about the rape. Helen said no. Jenna asked if they'd prioritized Jenna's well-being or their reputation when making decisions. Robert admitted it had been their reputation. Jenna asked if they understood that their actions had enabled David to abuse other girls. Helen started crying and said yes, they understood that now. Jenna told them she wasn't ready to forgive them, that the hurt was too deep and too sustained over too many years. She said maybe someday they could have a relationship, but right now she needed distance. I agreed. They left looking defeated. Part of me felt sorry for them, but a larger part recognized that consequences were necessary. They'd made choices that had harmed multiple people over multiple decades. Feeling bad about it now didn't erase that harm. I legally changed my birth certificate through a court order, establishing Jenna as my biological mother and removing Helen's name. The judge who approved it was the same one who'd presided over our civil case. He said he was glad to see justice done even in this small administrative way. My new birth certificate listed Jenna's name and left the father section blank since David had never been established as my legal father, and I had no interest in establishing that relationship. I changed my last name to match Jenna's maiden name, symbolically claiming my real identity. It felt important to have documentation that reflected the truth, even though it couldn't change the first 19 years of my life. Jenna framed the new birth certificate and hung it in our apartment. She said it represented years of truth finally acknowledged, of lies finally corrected. We were building a new life together, one based on honesty rather than deception. Some days were harder than others, processing the grief of lost time and stolen moments. But we were doing it together, mother and daughter finally able to claim those titles openly. David Thornton was eventually charged criminally based on evidence uncovered during the civil trial. Ashley's testimony and the corroborating evidence from the church documents gave prosecutors enough to move forward with charges for her assault. The statute of limitations hadn't expired for her case since she'd been assaulted more recently than Jenna. He was convicted and sentenced to 8 years in prison. It wasn't enough for all the harm he'd caused, but it was something. When the verdict was read, Jenna squeezed my hand and whispered that justice delayed was better than justice denied. Claire and Ashley and the other women who'd testified felt vindicated, their truth finally recognized by the legal system. The church in Arizona where David had most recently worked issued a formal apology to anyone he'd harmed and established a victims fund to provide counseling and support. 2 years after everything came out, Jenna and I were in a good place. We'd built a relationship that was uniquely ours, not defined by the lies we'd been forced to live or the systems that had failed us. I was in college studying social work, planning to work with survivors of abuse and institutional betrayal. Jenna had started speaking publicly about her experience, helping other survivors find their voices. Helen and Robert remained distant, their attempts at reconciliation repeatedly rejected, until they could truly understand and own the harm they'd caused. The truth had destroyed the false family structure, but built something more authentic in its place. Some nights I still grieved for the childhood I'd thought I had, for the parents I'd believed in. But mostly I was grateful for the mother I'd found, for the woman who'd carried me and loved me even when she'd been forced to hide that love behind the role of sister. Truth had cost us all dearly, but silence would have cost even more. If you enjoyed this, you'll definitely want to see the next ones too. So subscribe now and let me know your take in the comments.